when a homeless man is humiliated by a millionaire in front of the Queen. The attitude of a royal guard changes everything and surprises everyone, including the monarch. "Get off this sidewalk, you filthy disgrace! How dare you put yourself in front of the palace in this condition?" shouted a man who exuded elegance with his fine suit, polished shoes, and gold jewelry at a poor homeless man who was watching the royal guards. Thomas Whitmore was sitting in his usual spot, a discreet corner near the secondary gate of Buckingham Palace, where tourists rarely ventured. His battered military coat, with faded insignia that few still recognized, served as the only testimony of a previous life that seemed to belong to a completely different person. He did not actively beg for alms. He never did. There was something in his posture, even sitting against the damp stone wall, that suggested a dignity preserved through years of adversity. His paper cup was there, yes, but Thomas spent most of his time observing people, his light blue eyes following families, couples, groups of friends who hurried along the sidewalk. Sometimes someone would stop, drop a few coins, murmur words of encouragement. Thomas always thanked them with a nod of his head. That particular afternoon, an unusual movement stirred the surroundings of the palace. Royal guards were being positioned at closer intervals than usual, and Thomas could sense the controlled tension in their precise movements. Something important was about to happen, although he did not know exactly what. After 3 years living on those streets, Thomas had developed a particular sensitivity to the rhythms and patterns of the palace. That was when he saw the guard. Not just any guard, but the one Thomas had noticed before. Always at the same post during the afternoon shift. Tall, with broad shoulders that carried the characteristic red uniform with natural authority. But it was something in that man's eyes that had always captured the homeless man's attention. While most guards maintained an impassive expression, part of the tourist theater surrounding the palace, this one held a different intensity in his gaze. As if he were always evaluating, always attentive not only to protocol, but to people themselves. The guard's name was Jason Whites, although Thomas did not know that yet. Jason was 32 years old and had served 12 years in the Queen's Guard, a position he had achieved through years of impeccable service in the armed forces. There was something in his trajectory that set him apart from his colleagues, a visceral understanding that the uniform he wore represented something greater than protocols and ceremonies. Thomas watched Jason discreetly check his watch, a gesture so subtle that most would not notice, but that to someone trained to observe human behavior revealed anticipation. Something was definitely about to happen. The answer came minutes later, when a series of cars began to approach along the side street. They were not the heavy official vehicles that usually transported royalty on formal occasions, but elegant, discreet sedans that suggested a smaller event, perhaps an informal outing or return from a private engagement. The crowd, which moments before had been walking distractedly, began to gather, phones being raised in anticipation. Thomas remained where he was, unmoving. He had learned long ago that his place in the world did not include intruding on moments that did not belong to him. But he continued to observe, because observing was what remained to him, a way to stay connected to humanity even when he felt he no longer fully belonged to it. That was when Victor Ashford emerged from one of the nearby restaurants. Victor was the kind of man who occupied space aggressively, as if the world were a stage set exclusively for his performance. His suit was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than 3 months' salary of an average worker. His shoes shone even under the drizzle, and the watch on his wrist was the kind some people spent years saving to acquire. He was accompanied by 2 other men, equally well-dressed, and a blonde woman who laughed too loudly at his jokes. The kind of performative laughter that sought constant validation. Victor walked with the wide stride of someone who believes obstacles should naturally move out of his way, and that was exactly what he expected when he noticed the small crowd forming near the palace gates. Without hesitation, he began pushing through the crowd, using his shoulders to make a path, murmuring apologies that did not sound remotely sincere. That was when he nearly tripped over Thomas. Thomas had pulled his knees to his chest to take up less space when the crowd began to grow. But even so, his presence there, at that moment, became an inconvenience for Victor Ashford. Victor stopped abruptly, looked down with an expression that mixed surprise and disgust, as if he had discovered something unpleasant under his shoe. "You should find another place to do whatever it is you're doing here," Victor said, his voice carrying that specific tone wealthy people sometimes use with those they consider inferior, a mix of contempt and fake concern that fools no one. Thomas lifted his eyes, but said nothing. He had learned that silence was often the safest response. But Victor interpreted the silence as a challenge, or perhaps simply as an opportunity to perform for his audience. "Seriously, look at you," Victor continued, deliberately raising his voice to ensure the people around could hear him. "This is one of the most important places in London, and you're here, dirtying the sidewalk, driving tourists away. Have you no shame?" The blonde woman beside Victor let out a nervous laugh, and one of the men muttered something about the homeless problem these days. But no one in the crowd responded with approval. In fact, Thomas noticed several pairs of eyes fixed on Victor with visible discomfort. "I'm not bothering anyone," Thomas finally said, his voice low but clear, with an accent that revealed formal education at some point in his past. "Not bothering anyone?" Victor laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. "Your mere presence here is disturbing. People come to this place to see greatness, history, majesty, and instead they find, well, you." It was at that moment that the official cars finally stopped near the gates, and the crowd pressed closer, trying to get a better view. Victor, determined not to miss the opportunity, began pushing more aggressively through the people, and in the process, his foot connected with Thomas's paper cup, scattering the few coins across the wet pavement. "Oops," Victor said, without a trace of sincerity. "What a shame." Thomas watched the coins roll across the dark stone, disappearing among the feet of the crowd. It was maybe £3 in total, enough for a hot tea and perhaps a simple sandwich later. It wasn't much, but it was something. And now it was gone. He began to bend down to try to recover what he could, but Victor was already moving away, absorbed in the excitement of the crowd. What Victor Ashford did not know, what no one there knew at that moment, was that Jason Whites had observed the entire interaction. Jason was positioned just 10 meters away, motionless at his post as required by protocol, but his eyes had captured every word, every gesture, every nuance of that moment of casual cruelty. Jason knew men like Victor Ashford. He had served under the command of some of them early in his military career, officers who saw enlisted soldiers as interchangeable pieces on a personal chessboard. But he had also served with men like Thomas appeared to be, men who carried dignity even when the world denied them almost everything. The door of one of the official cars opened, and a figure emerged, shielded by a discreet umbrella. It was not the Queen herself, as many in the crowd had expected, but Princess Anne, known for her tireless work with charities and her no-nonsense personality. She was returning from a visit to a local hospital, part of her constant schedule of engagements that rarely made headlines, but maintained the relevance of the royal family in the fabric of British society. The princess began walking toward the gates, accompanied by 2 discreet security officers, when her gaze swept over the crowd. It was a habit developed through decades of public appearances, that ability to truly see people, rather than simply look through them. Her eyes rested briefly on Victor Ashford, who was practically hanging over the security barrier, phone raised, smiling with that exaggerated expression people make when they want to ensure they are capturing the best possible selfie. But then her eyes met Thomas, still crouched on the sidewalk, gathering coins with a quiet dignity that contrasted brutally with the scene around him. Something in his posture, in the way his shoulders remained straight even in that vulnerable position, captured the princess's attention. She stopped for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, and Jason White's saw recognition cross her face. It was the coat. The battered military coat Thomas wore was not just any old piece of clothing. To trained eyes, the faded insignia told a specific story. Princess Anne, who had served as colonel-in-chief of several regiments throughout her life, recognized those markings. She veered slightly from her path, moving toward where Thomas was, her security instantly alert but allowing the movement. The crowd, realizing something unusual was happening, began to quiet, a wave of silence spreading like ripples in still water. Victor Ashford, however, did not immediately notice the change. He was so absorbed in trying to capture the perfect angle for his photo, so focused on documenting his proximity to royalty for his social media followers, that he did not notice when the princess approached Thomas. "Sir," Princess Anne said, her voice carrying that calm authority that comes not from shouting but from absolute confidence. "Did you serve in the 2nd Battalion?" Thomas, still crouched, lifted his head so quickly that he nearly lost his balance. His eyes, which moments before had been fixed on the coins on the pavement, now met the princess's, and there was in them a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, shame, but also something that had been absent for a long time, a flicker of old pride. "Yes, Your Royal Highness," he replied, his voice breaking slightly, and then, as if his body remembered something his mind had tried to forget, he began to stand, moving into a position of attention, even dressed in rags, even with coins still scattered at his feet. The crowd was now completely silent. Phones that moments earlier had been capturing selfies were now recording this unexpected scene. Victor Ashford, finally realizing that something was happening, lowered his own phone, his expression shifting from performative excitement to genuine confusion. "How long did you serve?" the princess asked, and there was something in her voice now, a warmth that transformed the formal question into something more personal. 14 years, ma'am," Thomas replied, and his hands, which had trembled slightly while collecting the coins, were now steady at his sides, muscles remembering postures practiced thousands of times in another life. "And where did you serve?" she continued, stepping closer, completely indifferent to the wet pavement, the watching crowd, the protocols that probably said she should be entering the palace gates at that moment. Thomas hesitated. There were places he had seen, things he had done, that did not translate easily into polite conversation. But the expression on the princess's face was not casual curiosity. It was that of someone who understood that some questions needed to be asked, that some stories needed to be acknowledged. "Iraq, ma'am, then Afghanistan. 2 tours in each." Princess Anne nodded, and anyone who knew how to read her expressions could see the genuine respect in her eyes. She had spent decades working with veterans, visiting military hospitals, understanding the real cost of the service so many took for granted. "And now you are here?" she said, and it was not an accusation, but a recognition of a reality they both understood to be more common than it should be. That was when Victor Ashford, perhaps feeling he was losing control of the narrative, perhaps unable to bear not being the center of attention, decided to intervene. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice adopting a tone of feigned concern that made several members of the crowd visibly cringe. "This man has been here for hours, disturbing tourists, creating a very negative impression of this historic area. I was just trying to explain to him that there are proper shelters where he could stay." The princess turned to Victor, and the temperature around seemed to drop several degrees. There was something in the way she looked at him, a complete and instant assessment that made it clear she had measured Victor Ashford and found him significantly lacking. "And who are you?" she asked, and though the question was simple, it carried a weight that made Victor take half a step back. "Victor Ashford, ma'am. I am the chairman of Ashford Investments. We manage over 200 million in assets and—" "I did not ask what you do," the princess interrupted, her voice cutting through Victor's words like a blade through paper. "I asked who you are." The silence that followed was so deep that the sound of rain on the pavement seemed thunderous. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came out. Because for the first time in a long time, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, he was facing someone who was not impressed by his money, his status, his carefully cultivated list of professional achievements. "This man," Princess Anne continued, turning her attention back to Thomas but speaking loudly enough for everyone around to hear clearly, "spent 14 years serving his country. He went to places you were probably afraid to go on vacation. He did things that allowed you to build your fortune in peace and safety. And you think you have the right to humiliate him because life circumstances brought him to a difficult place?" Victor began to stammer something about not having intended disrespect, but the princess was not finished. "Wealth," she said, and each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread through the silent crowd, "is one of the easiest things to accumulate if you have the right circumstances, the right education, the right connections. Character, dignity, sacrifice, those are much rarer. And based on what I have just witnessed, Mr. Ashford, you may have an abundance of the former, but you are profoundly deficient in the latter." It was at that moment that Jason White's moved. Part 2. Protocols were clear about when royal guards could break formation. Threats to the royal family, medical emergencies, direct orders from superiors. What Jason was about to do did not fit any of those categories. But there were some things that transcended protocols. Some situations where being human had to come before being a soldier. Jason walked with measured steps to where Princess Anne and Thomas were, every movement precise, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. When he stopped beside Thomas, the formation created a powerful image. The princess, the homeless veteran, and the royal guard, 3 different representations of service to the nation, united in a moment that was already being captured by dozens of phones. "Your Royal Highness," Jason said, his voice firm but respectful, "with your permission, I would like to speak." Princess Anne turned to him, and Jason saw recognition in her eyes. She had noticed him before during her arrivals and departures, that guard who always seemed to be truly paying attention instead of simply executing rehearsed movements. She nodded, granting permission. "I saw what happened here today," Jason began, and though he was ostensibly speaking to the princess, his words were directed at the crowd, at Victor Ashford, at anyone who was listening. "I saw a man arrive on these sidewalks seeking spectacle, a photo for his social media, something to show his friends that he had been close to greatness. And I saw another man sitting in silence, asking for nothing, disturbing no one, simply existing in a public space as any citizen has the right to do." Jason paused, allowing his words to settle, and when he continued, there was an intensity in his voice that came from somewhere deep. "I also served, 8 years in the armed forces before joining the Guard. I saw men like Thomas." He nodded towards the veteran. "Men who gave everything they had, not because they expected reward, not because they wanted recognition, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. And I saw men like you." He turned to Victor, and there was something in his gaze that made the businessman take another step back. Men who measure their own worth by the size of their bank accounts, and then use that wealth as justification to treat others as less than human. Victor tried to interrupt, his face reddening, but Jason continued, his voice rising enough to cut through any protest. You want to know what true greatness is, Mr. Ashford? It is not how much money you manage. It is not how many assets you control. It is not having the perfect selfie with royalty. It is how you treat people when there is nothing to gain from it. It is maintaining your dignity when the world denies you everything else. It is sacrificing your own comfort, your own safety, potentially your own life, so that others may live in peace. The crowd, which had been silent, began to murmur in approval. Some started to applaud, but Jason raised a hand, asking for silence. He was not finished. "This man," Jason said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder, "has probably seen things you could not process in your worst nightmares. He has likely lost friends, carried wounded comrades, made decisions in seconds that you would spend weeks debating in your comfortable boardrooms. And then he came home to a society that quickly forgets, that sees veterans as statistics instead of people, that offers thank you for your service, but does not offer the real, ongoing support that so many need to reintegrate into civilian life." Thomas was looking at the ground now, his shoulders trembling slightly, and Jason squeezed his shoulder more firmly, a silent connection between two men who shared something civilians could never fully understand. "You know what really makes me angry?" Jason continued, and now there was a passion in his voice that turned his words into something more than a speech, something closer to a confession. "It's not that people like you exist, Mr. Ashford. People who value money over character. The world has always had those people. What makes me angry is that we, as a society, allow those people to define what success means. We see someone in an expensive suit and assume wisdom. We see someone on the streets and assume failure. But what if we are measuring the wrong things? What if the homeless man knows more about courage, about sacrifice, about the true meaning of being human than the millionaire ever will?" Princess Anne was watching Jason with an expression that mixed surprise and something that looked like pride. She had witnessed many speeches in her life, many well-rehearsed words, but she had rarely seen someone speak with such raw authenticity, such visible discomfort with injustice. "Sergeant Whites," she said softly, and the use of his rank instead of simply guard made Jason look at her quickly. "You are, of course, right, and I think it is time we do more than simply talk about these issues." She turned to Thomas, who had lifted his gaze again, tears tracing clean lines through the dirt on his cheeks. "Sir," she said, "I would like to extend you an invitation. Next week, I will be presiding over a charity event for homeless veterans. I would very much like you to attend as my personal guest. Not to be displayed, not to be used as an example, but because I believe you have a perspective we need to hear." Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the princess, then at Jason, then at the crowd around, as if he could not fully process what was happening. I don't have appropriate clothes to," he began, but the princess interrupted him gently. "That can be arranged. What I need is not your clothes. It is your voice, your experience, your story. How many other men and women are on the streets today because we did not?" She paused, then continued with an intensity that made every person in the crowd involuntarily lean forward. "We failed you. As a nation, as a society, we failed. And I cannot undo that, but I can ensure that your voice is heard, that your story is told, that perhaps, just perhaps, we can prevent others from following the same path." That was when something extraordinary happened. A woman in the crowd, an older lady with gray hair and kind eyes, began to walk toward Thomas. She was holding a 20-pound note. "Please," she said, extending the money, "take this. It's not much, but maybe it helps." Thomas looked at the money, then at the woman, and something in his expression broke. It was not the pleading Victor had interpreted in his earlier silence. It was pure, raw gratitude, the kind of emotion that comes when you have been invisible for so long that any recognition of your humanity feels like a miracle. I can't, he began, but the woman was already pressing the money into his hand. You can and you will, she said firmly. My husband served in the Falklands. He was lucky. He came back. He got the support he needed. But I saw so many who didn't. Please accept this not as charity, but as recognition, as an apology from all of us who did not do enough. And then, as if a dam had been broken, other people began to approach. A young man took off his own coat and offered it to Thomas. A woman with a small child in her arms asked her husband to go to the nearby cafe and bring hot food. Person after person, offering what they could, not with pity, but with respect. Victor Ashford stood motionless, watching it all unfold, his face a complex mask of emotions. Shame, certainly, but also confusion, as if the world had suddenly begun operating by rules he did not understand. The blonde woman who had been with him had stepped away, visibly uncomfortable with the association, and his two business colleagues seemed to be trying to become invisible. Jason watched Victor for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of that burning passion, replaced by something closer to pity. It's not too late for you, Mr. Ashford, Jason said. It's not too late to recognize that there is more to life than accumulation, that there is more to being human than managing assets, that maybe, just maybe, the true measure of a man is not how much he has, but how much he is willing to give. Victor looked at Jason, then at Thomas, who was now surrounded by people offering help, offering solidarity, offering basic humanity that should always have been there. And then, in a moment that surprised everyone, especially himself, Victor began walking toward Thomas. The crowd parted, creating a path, and Victor stopped a few steps from the veteran. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain had stopped, and a late afternoon ray of sun was breaking through the clouds, lighting the scene with an almost theatrical golden glow. Victor began, his voice catching. I was wrong. The words came out with difficulty, as if they were physically painful to say, but there was something in them, an emerging sincerity that transformed the moment from performative to genuine. I looked at you and saw only someone who had failed, someone who hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't tried hard enough. I saw what I'm afraid of becoming, and then I turned that fear into cruelty, because it's easier to blame you than to examine my own blind privilege. Thomas was looking at Victor now, and there was something in his expression that was not triumph, not satisfaction at seeing his aggressor humbled, but rather a deep, almost sad understanding of how much courage those words had required. I don't want your money, Thomas said softly, his first real contribution to the conversation since Princess Anne had initiated all of this. I don't want your pity. What I want, what we all want. He gestured vaguely to the streets around, to the other homeless people who surely existed somewhere in the urban landscape, is to be seen, not as problems to be solved, not as statistics, not as moral failures, but as people. Just people who went through hard things and need a little help to come back. His voice, which had begun hesitant, was growing in confidence now, years of forced silence finally breaking. I didn't wake up one day and decide to live on the streets. I came back from my last tour with things in my head I didn't know how to process. Noises made me dive for cover. Crowds made me panic. I couldn't keep a job because I couldn't keep myself together. And slowly, so slowly, I barely noticed until it was too late. I lost everything. My apartment, my friends, my dignity, or so I thought. He looked around at all the faces watching him, all the attention focused on him in a way he hadn't felt since he was in uniform. But I learned something being here, on these streets. I learned that you don't lose your dignity because you lose your address. You don't lose your worth because you lose your bank account. Those things can be taken away, but who you are, what you did, the sacrifices you made, no one can take that away. Not even when they try to make you forget it. Princess Anne was smiling now, a genuine smile that transformed her face, and Jason felt a wave of emotion he had to push down, maintaining the composure his training demanded. "Sir," the princess said, addressing Thomas, "I would like to do more than simply invite you to an event. I would like to connect you with resources, with people who can help you find stable housing, treatment for whatever you are dealing with psychologically, perhaps even employment if you are interested. But more importantly, I would like you to help me. To help me understand what we truly need to do as a society to ensure that veterans like you never fall through the cracks again." She turned to Jason. "And you, Sergeant Whites. You clearly care deeply about these issues. I would like you to be involved as well. We need voices like yours, people who understand both military service and the system's failures." Jason nodded, unable to trust his voice in that moment. There was something deeply surreal about standing there, in his uniform, being addressed by royalty about issues that had kept him awake so many nights, issues he had thought were too big, too systemic for any one person to address. Victor Ashford stood there, still visibly uncomfortable, but something in his posture had changed. Defensive arrogance had been replaced by something closer to genuine humility. "I would like to help too," he said, and this time his voice was steadier. "Financially, I mean. I know money doesn't solve everything, but I have resources. And maybe it's time I use those resources for something more meaningful than just accumulating more wealth." Princess Anne studied him for a long moment, and Jason could see her weighing sincerity against performance, substance against show. Finally, she nodded. "Then I will hold you to that promise, Mr. Ashford. Not a one-time donation that lets you feel better about yourself, but real, ongoing commitment. We will see whether your revelation today lasts." The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their lives but visibly changed by what they had witnessed. Phones had captured everything, and Jason knew videos of that moment would be circulating online within hours. He wondered how his break of protocol would be received by his superiors, whether there would be consequences for his unauthorized speech. But looking at Thomas, seeing the way the veteran stood now, no longer hunched against a wall but upright, dignified, finally seen as the man he had always been, Jason decided any consequences were worth it. Princess Anne was organizing contact cards, making sure Thomas had ways to reach her, when one of the discreet security officers approached and murmured something in her ear. She nodded, clearly being reminded of other commitments waiting. "Sir," she said to Thomas, "I must go, but please reach out. I am serious about this. Your story needs to be heard. Your voice needs to be part of the conversation." Thomas nodded, clutching the cards as if they were the most precious objects he had ever held. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking again. "Thank you for seeing me." Those words, simple but carrying so much meaning, hung in the air as the princess nodded one last time and began walking toward the palace gates. Her security flanked her, but she stopped once more, turning to the remaining crowd. "All of you saw something important today," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet afternoon air. "You saw what happens when we truly look at one another, when we recognize humanity in places society has taught us to ignore. Do not let this moment be only that, a moment. Carry it with you. See the people who pass you on the streets. Recognize that each of them has a story, a journey, a dignity that deserves respect." And then she was gone, disappearing through the historic gates, but the ripples she had started kept expanding. Jason finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though he was still technically on duty. He turned to Thomas, who was being embraced by the older woman who had first offered money, now engaged in a serious conversation about which shelters had the best resources. which charities were most helpful. "Will you be all right?" Jason asked quietly. Thomas looked at him, and there were tears in his eyes again. But this time they were tears of relief, of hope, of possibility. "I think so," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think so." "I mean it about staying involved," Jason said. "If you need anything, leave a message at the barracks. They'll know how to find me." Thomas nodded, then, in a gesture that surprised them both, offered his hand. Jason took it, and the two men stood there for a moment. Two people who had served their country in different ways, whose paths had crossed in this unlikely moment, and who had decided that crossing would mean something. Victor Ashford was still nearby, watching, and when Thomas finally walked away with the older woman, Victor approached Jason. I really messed up, didn't I?" he said, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that Jason imagined was rare. "You did," Jason agreed, seeing no point in softening it. "But you also had the courage to admit it. That's something. It's not enough, not yet, but it's a start." "How do I do better?" Victor asked, and the question was so direct, so genuinely perplexed, that Jason almost laughed. Here was a man who had probably navigated deals worth millions, who probably had advisors for every aspect of his life, and he had no idea how to simply be a better person. "You start by seeing people," Jason said. "Not as opportunities, not as obstacles, not as things to be managed or ignored, but as people. You start by recognizing that privilege is not the same as merit, that wealth is not the same as worth, that the man in an expensive suit and the man in rags both have dignity, history, humanity." Victor nodded slowly, processing, and Jason could see mental gears turning, trying to fit these ideas into a world view that had likely never made room for them before. "It's a lot harder than just writing a check, isn't it?" Victor finally said. "Much harder," Jason agreed, "but also much more important." 3 weeks later, Jason was sitting in an elegant conference room in one of London's historic hotels, surrounded by people he had never imagined he would meet. Princess Anne was there, of course, presiding over a task force she had quickly assembled on issues of homeless veterans. Thomas was there too. Clean now, with new clothes, having spent the last few weeks in a transitional housing program the princess had arranged. But there were others too. Charity leaders, psychologists specializing in PTSD, representatives from the Ministry of Housing, even a few politicians who had been shamed by the viral coverage of that day outside the palace into paying attention. And, to Jason's surprise, Victor Ashford was there too. He had kept his word, establishing a substantial fund for veteran support. But more importantly, he had started showing up, listening, learning. He was still awkward with it, still made mistakes, but he was trying, and Jason had learned to respect genuine effort even when imperfect. "What we need to understand," Thomas was saying, his voice clear and confident in a way it never had been when he sat on that cold sidewalk, "is that the problem is not just housing. It's not just mental health treatment, though God knows we need more of that. It's about how society sees veterans. We put you in uniforms, send you to horrible places, ask you to do impossible things, and then, when you come back changed by those experiences, we act like it's a character flaw instead of an inevitable result of what we forced you to do." The room was silent, everyone absorbing his words, and Jason felt that same wave of emotion he had felt weeks earlier. This mattered. This was real. This was change happening not in political abstractions, but in real, vulnerable human conversations. "So how do we change that?" Princess Anne asked. And it was clear she was not asking rhetorically. She truly wanted to know. And as the discussion continued, plans taking shape, commitments being made, Jason looked around the room and thought about how a single moment of casual cruelty, met with a single moment of courage, had led to this. Sometimes change happens through laws passed and policies implemented. But sometimes, just sometimes, it begins with one person deciding to see another person, to truly see them, and refusing to look away. And as Jason watched Thomas lead that room full of powerful people, not with the timid apologies of someone who had internalized his own invisibility, but with the confidence of someone who finally remembered his own worth, he knew that rainy day outside Buckingham Palace would be something he carried with him for the rest of his life. Not because he had broken protocol, not because he had given a speech, but because he had chosen, in that moment, to put humanity above rules, to see a person instead of a problem, and to act on that vision even when it would have been easier to simply stay in formation and stare straight ahead. Sometimes that was all it took. Someone willing to take the first step. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Share in the comments the word "good guard" so I can leave a beautiful heart and tell me. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an act of kindness that changed your perspective on life and relationships? Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our next throne stories.